when Sri Aurobindo took up the struggle for India's freedom from colonial rule, it was considered impossible that India could ever become free. All that the prior efforts were limited to was to appease, to appeal, to find some kind of balance with the colonial rulers who were obviously superior in every way. When he spoke of complete freedom, he was considered an extremist, a fantasy that he was chasing. But the reason he gave is much more important. The reason he said it's not that we hate the British, it's not even whether they are good rulers or bad rulers. The reason he said, looking at the far future of humanity, that for the survival of humanity, India has a role to play. For humanity's survival, this gift of spirituality is necessary from India, which only India can give. For India to be able to make that gift to the world, she has to herself find her own soul. And in order to find her soul, she must first be free to be able to do that. Therefore, the necessity for India's freedom. In 1947, India won her political freedom. And I would say quite without controversy that India did not win her economic freedom, her cultural freedom, her intellectual freedom, and not yet even her spiritual freedom. If anything, in the last 10 years, something of India's cultural identity has been given a first chance to stand out and find its roots, let's say, find its forms. It's been given a chance, which until then, at every step, was beaten back by a very organized machinery which we inherited from the British. It's obvious to see its external forms of governance. When under British rule, the most powerful person on the ground was the collector. To this day, he is called the collector. To this day, he is still the most powerful person on the ground for governance. What is the job of the collector? Is to collect taxes. That's why he is a collector. Why is the most powerful position of organizational authority one who dominates and takes away from you rather than serving you? Because when we inherited, or when India became free politically, we inherited the entire machinery of domination and colonization and did not bother to change it. So to this day, our current rulers are dominators, usurpers, colonizers of India. The only difference is you elected them, or you had the illusion of electing them. Because actually you didn't have a choice. When you go to place your vote, and I think all of you have lived long enough, not just the last 10 years, to say that in most cases you don't care who comes to power, you don't want any of them to come to power, but you don't have a choice. So you pick the least bad, the least perverse, hoping that this time he might be different. That's not a choice. Worse still, for those who stand for elections, the culture of entering that process of getting elected requires you to be perverse, to be a colonizer, otherwise you cannot get into those halls. And this culture continued because it was the same culture the British formed. Jawaharlal Nehru in his interview with Kenneth Galbraith, US ambassador, which is recorded by Kenneth Galbraith in his book. Galbraith writes, Nehru leaned over to me and in a conspiratorial whisper said, "You know, I am the last Englishman to rule India." This is such an important statement because it reveals to you the reality of this so-called political freedom. The man who is picked, and I don't say elected, he was picked, he was not elected. The man who is picked to become the first Prime Minister of India considers himself an Englishman. It was said that he would send his clothes to dry clean to Paris because India was not his world. He didn't consider himself an Indian. He knew nothing about Indian civilizational values and traditions. He fitted entirely into the British colonial agenda and was proud of it. Worse still, he considered his role as Prime Minister to rule India and not serve India. This underwent a radical change for the first time 10 years ago when Narendra Modi came to power as Prime Minister and declared himself not Prime Minister, Prime Servant. Now, you could say it's just political posturing, but what you see in what followed was at least an attempt to put that into practice. And that shift in culture started with one man. There was nobody else who had even that line of thinking. From one man, for it to percolate, hopefully, into the larger community of rulers, it's not an easy job. Perhaps 10 years is not enough because they don't want to change. The entire bureaucracy is still thinking as themselves as rulers. For me, it is still a shock to see when a bureaucrat travels in a car in a little town like Pondicherry, which is an entire state, interestingly. They behave as if they look down snootily at all the people around. They have their car horns. There's a police which pushes you away, hushing you around so that they can ride through as if they were the British rulers of 70 years ago. When you enter the halls of the High Court or the Supreme Court, Chennai High Court, let's say, you're walking in the hall to go to a hearing that you are pleading for justice which you will never get, and you know how that works. Suddenly you hear a hissing sound from behind you. There's a young man dressed with like the colonial servants with this finery, red cap and all those things, holding a large stick. He walks down the corridor and shouts, "S." Like you're little scum of the earth, your little cockroaches, move off. And just behind him, there's this royalty of the judge who walks behind, like he owns the place and you're there to beg his favor, hoping for something. This culture is still prevalent. At no point have we stopped to question, are we still ruled by the British in Indian skin? Is this still the continuation of colonization? Is this what we really want? Is this what we fought for? And therefore I say, we have not really won our freedom. It was just a political gimmick to replace one lot by another lot with the same mindset. How has it changed? The thinking is still looking at India from outside India, from sitting in Europe or in England. Textbooks would be in a faraway country like India. The poetry you had to read was about snowfall and 4 seasons. No, in India we have 6 seasons. You can't even say that because none of your textbooks recognize that there are 6 seasons. It's a different matter that we speak in English. But the values that are instilled in the framework of the language itself tend to override your innate values which come from your vernacular if you were lucky enough to have grown up for the first 10 years in your vernacular. Otherwise, you were already formed in the English language and the mindset and the values and the cultural baggage that comes with it. So our freedom struggle is not finished. What Sri Aurobindo foresaw 100 years ago and worked for to free India is not yet complete. Sri Aurobindo himself set the framework for the larger work, seeing that it would not happen in his lifetime. And the first thing he did, along with the political movement which was for freedom, he set the framework of what that freedom constituted of. And a significant part of that work was his work in education, to formulate a new framework of education, which today we call integral education, where he became himself the head of the college and set the framework for this. He wrote extensively about what that would have to be like. And in fact, it is the only framework of education which is truly universal. It was for humanity, but India was meant to be the base in which this reformation of the education itself would take place, by which a whole new generation of people would grow up more rooted in the deeper and truly universal values and the civilizational roots that India stands for. That has not yet happened, or it has happened sporadically in a few spots, partially, etc. And just the fact that even this is not part of our national discourse shows you how backward we are in relation to this objective. And it is institutions like Brhat which are today trailblazing that effort. And I'm really grateful for all that you've been doing and all of you who are participating in this effort. This needs to widen out on a national scale. But you have to understand that the entire machinery of bureaucracy, of the media, the educational system, even the teachers, are set to resist. Sri Aurobindo makes this observation in 1938-39 when he's sitting with 2 or 3 people who are his senior disciples, let's say, who have been with him for 20 years perhaps. They've all been British educated. And he says to them, you people do not know what is the Indian mind. You are half European in your mind. And it's something which I spent a lot of time trying to introspect, to recognize, and what does it mean to shift into an Indian mind or a way of thinking. And Sri Aurobindo writes extensively about what that is and the intuitivization necessary even to come to that. But this shows you the nature of the struggle ahead. And I've just touched upon this one aspect of the education and mind freedom. There is the economic freedom, and there is the cultural freedom, and then the spiritual freedom. And perhaps all these, or perhaps none of these would become possible unless the spiritual freedom is first established. Because India is essentially a spiritual civilization. And if you do not recognize that, and if you try to rebuild civilizational values without this spiritual content, you will fail. Or you will create at best an imitation or a distortion. I see today, for example, in an attempt to indigenize education in Bombay, it was maybe 15-20 years ago, they said, Mary had a little lamb was still taught in kindergarten, by the way. Yeah, you all know it by heart, isn't it? None of you here does not know. Why is that? Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow. And I had never seen snow. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what a lamb was. Of course, they had a picture. And it followed her to school, so the teacher got upset and sent her out. It made the children laugh and play to see a lamb at school, so the teacher turned him out. That means you're not supposed to laugh and play in school. You see the implications of this. And teacher turns him out. You should not be with a lamb. You should not like animals. It's infra-dig to be with an animal, to have a pet. There are all kinds of perversion in this very simple rhyme, which is given to you at kindergarten, when you don't even have any idea of what these words mean, and it stays with you for life. So there was an attempt to indigenize. What did they do? They changed the wording. Meera had a little cat. Its fur was white as I don't know what they did. You see what that means? You have recovered your freedom now because now you have said Meera had a little cat. The same rhyme, the same song. It's a poor imitation of European colonized minds. Because the mind is so colonized, it does not even know what it should be, or it has no idea of what it can be to be free. And it just continues to run in its own little grooves with a few superficial modifications, and you say, now I'm free to think. You see how difficult the problem is. And that's why the attempt at the Sri Aurobindo ashram, when the mother had so many refugees come at the beginning of the Second World War with their children, she started the school to precisely make this change, that children could grow up from scratch with a new mindset which would not be bound in the old. The problem? The teachers. They were bound in the old mindset. Many of them opposed, resisted actively. So here was a text from Sri Aurobindo which said how the education should be, and a few people trying to practice, and others viciously against. And some of them are big names. It would hurt you even to hear that so-and-so was somebody who was very close to Sri Aurobindo, who was part of those evening talks, which I said where Sri Aurobindo said you're half European, was one of the focal points for the opposition. And there was a struggle of two worlds. I'm pointing to this because this is exactly what is happening on a universal scale today, on a global scale, let's say generally. Across humanity, there are two conflicting value systems rising. One which looks to the future and has a relevance for the future, even if partially. The other which looks to the past or is bound in certain grooves of limitation and perversion which have no value for the future or even are hostile to the future of humanity, hostile to the awakening of consciousness. This is the battle that is going on, and it's a battle which is very subtle because it is the battle of mindset, paradigm, values so deep, so essential that one side does not even know what it's like to be the other. If it could experience the other, it would say, yes, this is superior. It does not. It's so bound in its own narrowness and rigidity and belief systems. And this is the great battle taking place within India, across nations. But Sri Aurobindo makes this observation: the future of humanity is dependent on whether we choose to follow one paradigm or other. Broadly, we will call it, for lack of a better phrasing, the European paradigm and the Indian paradigm. But recognize within Europe there are seeds of the Indian, what we would call the Indian. Within India, we have not seeds but gigantic trees of the European paradigm. So I use this only when you look back 200 or 300 or 1,000 years ago, India of maybe 2,000 years ago, or the roots of Indian civilization, which would be Vedic. So we can say Vedic paradigm versus the European developmental or existential paradigm, which is not just developmental. Because as it has happened in Europe, even science that we teach today, which we consider to be so free of religion, so free, so neutral, so universal, is deeply rooted in the religious paradigm of Europe. The Big Bang Theory, do you know where it comes from? Because God said, let there be light, and there was light, and the universe was born in 7 days. So coming out from that, after throwing out the whole, including the spiritual content of the religion of Christianity and the church, the secularized scientists, now becoming rationalists, still had the baggage of the world is born by God's command. All of your physics, you're taught laws of physics. Have you ever questioned who creates the law? How does he or she or it or machinery of energy maintain the law? It's a big question, right? And why is the law the way it is and not otherwise? It's a very important question. But this whole thinking of law comes from the Christianity, where the whole teaching of the Abrahamic traditions was to obey the laws that God has set, which are taught in your holy book. So you threw out the holy book, you threw out the church, but the concept and thinking of law-based existence continued in science. There is no such thing. There is no law because there is no law creator supposedly in science. So how can you call it a law? And what is the mechanism of its maintenance? What is the mechanism of its selection as a law? Nothing is there. They will say, that's not our domain, that's the philosophers. But then your science is incomplete. But if you come within the Indian context, with the same science, the same observations, finally what is science doing? It's observing things, summarizing them and calling it a law. Why not call it observations? Right? But this is the backlog of the context and the religion. You come to India, the whole thinking is very different. We don't call it laws of God. We speak of prakriti, that conscious power by which creates and forms, projects by forming. The word itself, prakriti, tells you the meaning of what that is. And it's an energy, it is a conscious energy. So science, by its observation, comes to the fact that all matter is energy. But where did the energy come from? How does it move this way? We don't know. That's philosophy. It's not science then. But in India, you would say that matter is energy, is clear. That energy is conscious energy, and she chooses to ripple out in certain rhythms, and that is the dance of Shiva. And those rhythms, because they are on a cosmic scale, appear to be consistent across space, sometimes across time, but generally they change also across time. Those are what science today, European science, would call laws of physics. And you notice there are no more laws when it comes into the domain of chemistry or psychology, biology. They become more and more blurred and free. And here you have an understanding of why, and the continuum across physics, chemistry, biology, and psychology is all held because it is one energy working on different gradations of freedom of its working. So yes, you still observe, you still formalize, you still utilize, but you know these are not absolute binding rhythms that you can modify. And because it is conscious energy, your consciousness can modify energy. I'm digressing from my main objective, but it's to highlight the difference between these two approaches. And you can see how this approach suddenly liberates you not only of the full power of current science, but it integrates with psychology and it integrates with yoga and gives you the freedom to change the law by engaging with the consciousness behind things. This becomes the basis of so many miraculous or other processes, even which science is documenting. You have a more comprehensive science, a greater science, which has been discarded, which is considered to be ridiculous because it's not fitting the European framework of science. You see how the media fights you when you question or you speak of consciousness within the domain of science, unless you fit it in what is acceptable in Europe currently or in the US. That is a colonized mind, which is still looking at its colonial masters and saying, unless they say it is not science, they define what is science, I cannot apply my own independent thinking or even a superior way of looking at the science. You understand how serious this is? You understand that after 70 years, no attempt has been made to change this mindset. Our educational system is still driven by the same colonized rulers. And I've met people within the government, spoken to them, given them very concrete suggestions and practical, and they say, first they say, what can we do? You say this, you can do this. Yes, but that's very difficult. It ends there. Nobody wants to change. And I'm saying even after 10 years of the Modi government, this is the one thing I point to as a failure of the government. I can understand it took you 5 years. I can understand it took you more than 5 years. But after 10 years, there is no change. I'm sorry. It's not good enough. And why? It's not that he doesn't want to. The machinery for execution is not ready for, does not know, does not want, actively opposes, and all kinds of other interests, national and international, creep in and block every attempt. What is needed to change that? Your awakening. Until you are awake, that change cannot happen because they can get away with it because we choose to not respond, because we choose to be asleep. And when sufficient numbers wake up and begin to demand this, suddenly there will be a flip, there will be a change. And that's why you look at the bigger picture. Yes, there are top-down changes. Yes, they should be talked about, which are still not being done. But much more important in the long run is the awakening of the people to this deeper truth of their own civilizational values and culture. This is what Sri Aurobindo was looking to. Unless India is free, she cannot find her own soul, her own roots, and put into practice what is that spiritual tradition, culture, life forms which have been built up across millennia, which then would be a gift to humanity. Yoga being one of those gifts, you see what has happened as it goes to the West, it turns around, completely flips, becomes gymnastics or therapy. So you have dog yoga, you have crystal yoga, you have laughter yoga. What's it got to do with union with the self? Nothing. It's been reduced to therapy. You take the word therapy, you replace the word yoga by therapy, that's all they mean. And I was part of a conference, they invited me, at the end of the conference, they declared the theme in Europe for the next conference. They said, does yoga belong to India, or can we now say Europe owns yoga because we have made so many innovations? That was the theme of the conference. I had to say something which was partly diplomatic. I said it doesn't even belong to India. It belongs to the rishis who created it for humanity. India was the repository. Even Indians today don't value it. So it's not yours either until you value it and own it as something which is yours. But it belongs to the rishis. It will never belong to Europe in that sense. You cannot say that you made an innovation, you made it hot yoga, so now you own it. It doesn't work like that. But the meaning of yoga itself has been so perverted. Tantra has been reduced to sexuality and Kama Sutra basically. Everything you take across, and this is typically in the Americanism, a reduction is to something populist, momentary excitation, and then thrown out to be replaced by another or perverted in some form. This is something Sri Aurobindo warns about. That's why I'm saying it. In the Foundations of Indian Culture, all of you should read it, by the way. He describes all the characteristics of the civilizational values all the way to its roots in governance, in politics, in art, in sciences, in every way. And the spiritual roots all the way, and shows you how it forms, how it developed, etc. And in the very first chapter, he warns, be careful, do not expose these to the West too soon, prematurely, because they will take it and distort it and project it back as their discovery upon you. Which is happening with yoga already, isn't it? So this is an introduction to what I want to highlight. And the question really is, which value system will lead to the future? If India fails in this awakening, Sri Aurobindo was asked this question, what if India cannot? He says, well, the truth will move elsewhere. But among all possible centers of receptivity within humanity, India is still the best in potential. And that's why we really have to question ourselves. What is the priority? What are we living for? And it will all come back to you, whether you choose to find your own spiritual roots. Without that, you would not find the roots of your own civilization. Isn't it? To that extent, as you rediscover your spiritual roots, you will also rediscover the universality of what the Indian civilization tried to express, and that would be the gift to humanity. So, we look at the big picture, and I will step back and go back to what was the most ancient concept of spirituality. Because our current modern concept of spirituality in India is already a distortion and a limitation. When you tell young people, oh, spiritual life, what is the first response you get? That's what I will do when I retire. Right now, I want to live my life. I want to enjoy life. And they'll say it very openly. Somehow, spirituality is not enjoyment of life, it's suffering. And it requires you to abandon life. Therefore, I'm not ready for that. The moment you have made this split, you've already lost your roots of civilization. Then what do you do to enjoy life? You imitate the West. Live for the moment, carpe diem, seize the moment, seize the day, or fulfill some social, superficial objectives, and it stops there. That's spiritual. Oh, he's so spiritual, he's running an orphanage. That's not spirituality. So, the problem is the concept of spirituality as it currently survives, which we perpetuate wrongly. Notice the word spiritual immediately evokes in you a picture of somebody sitting bare-bodied, sitting in a cave, or ochre robes, etc. Go back to the roots of spirituality in India, and that is in the Veda. What were Vedic rishis like? And you know those from the stories you have been told, and as recorded in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, which would be even post the Vedic age, but already there's a remnant of the momentum of that age. And you can see what happens. The princes and princesses are sent to the rishis' ashrama to study what? Governance, economics, warfare, strategy, sciences, arts, etc. You're taught that there are 64 arts that you have to master to have true mastery of the arts. And this is just separate from the sciences and governance. When a king has a problem of governance, doesn't know what to do, he goes to the rishi to ask his advice. What should I do in such a situation? The man with all the experience of governance goes to somebody who has a greater experience. Yeah, but those rishis were living in the forests. What did they know? They had an entire school, college, university of learners around them. And the best minds, the most powerful training program that would allow you to come back and take charge of ruling an entire state. That was what was provided. Now, we don't know enough of the details because we have only the teachings broadly and the framework of this relationship between the kings and the rishis, teachers. But we do recognize from this that it was not just casually. It's not like in the picture, there are 2 or 3 people around the teacher, and it's a large community of learners in which all this knowledge is being taught. When they come back, they're ready to govern. That's the scope and comprehensiveness of the learning, of the teaching. There are texts of governance which also come from such, which today are entirely applicable as they are, with a few changes of terminology in modern times. But the techniques, the methods, the principles on which they are founded are applicable. You will see all of the Shastras, there are more superficial, there are more profound Shastras. Shastras are codified teachings. All of the Shastras go back to first principles and foundational ideas. Nobody starts by saying, oh, this is good, that is bad, therefore follow. They say, if you go back to the essence, these are universal principles. Therefore, this is the consequence. That's why these teachings are so universal and also eternal application, changing of vocabulary being common. All of them trace themselves back to the Veda. So our concept of the spiritual leaders, the Vedic rishis, now needs to change. They were not people who abandoned life. They had mastery of life. They taught mastery of life. The Veda itself teaches you that the entire world is body of God, manifestation of the divine. And what happens, you see, subsequently, as there is this massive efflorescence of the civilizational values and wealth and knowledge and technology, application of the knowledge, and arts and sciences and music and effective governance going back for thousands of years without needing to loot and plunder others. It reaches a point where there's a danger of losing yourself in the plenitude of life. And then comes this question, what to do about that suffering? What to do about this thing which remains now? After all is satisfied externally, what do I do with the suffering within me? And this gives rise to the Buddha and Buddhism. But I'm going to take a momentary departure. Why I'm highlighted some of these things. You see, in the European model of economic development, every time, we take one good example, which is the Roman Empire, every time an empire collapses when it stops invading and taking over others. In other words, the empire is sustained on plunder of others. Knowledge is gained by stealing from others. There is not this inherent ability to create self-sustaining wealth, except perhaps basic needs, a static society, but not growth and plenitude, unless you somehow invade from others or take over from others. The moment you stop that, you collapse. All the civilizational wealth, where does this come from? Okay. All the civilizational development is associated with expansion. India is the only civilization which actually discovered the key to growth, plenitude of wealth, of everything without needing to conquer others. Self-sustaining, comprehensive model of development. And this is very important to recognize. And it's not for 100 years, it's not 300 years, it's not even 1,000 years, it's for many thousand years. Therefore, you see even the texts of the Greeks, Romans, Chinese who visit India, they say, oh, this is the land of milk, honey, this is the land of knowledge, this is the land of light. So the Greeks look to India as the land of wealth and knowledge. Even in the Egyptian texts, Roman texts, Europe, all the way to France, going back a few hundred years, you have texts describing wealth from India. You read your Shakespeare. Do you know The Merchant of Venice? This guy is in big trouble because his ships have drowned. Ships coming from India. That was his investment. And at the end of the story, suddenly he discovers, no, his ships didn't drown and the ships have come back. Suddenly he has become wealthy overnight, one of the wealthiest. Why? Trade with India was the means of wealth. Why? In one of the British museums, I recall seeing the image of some Indian jewelry 200 years ago demonstrated in Paris, and it created a shockwave in Europe that human hands could create something so subtle and rich and complex with gold. And so it became a provocation to imitate that through machinery, which is the reason why to this day European jewelry resembles Indian jewelry. It's that way. It went from India to Europe, not the other way. To this day, India is processor for 9/10 of the diamonds in the world. India had the world's only diamond mines until the British discovered mines in Africa. But the processing of diamonds as a technology was inherent to India going back millennia. Gold also was largely produced within India. Steel, which is more valuable than gold, is what the Europeans wanted to take back. In the great battle between the Persian leader and the Greek leader, there is the Greek leader who comes and takes a huge sword and bludgeons a big log of wood, showing his strength. And on the other side, the Persian, with a thin, fine sword of Indian steel, takes his scarf, throws it in the air and swishes and cuts it, demonstrating the swiftness, precision. And obviously in the battle he won. But all this is to show that the roots from all those cultures look towards India for knowledge and wealth. And a sustained, no need to plunder others to build your knowledge and wealth. This is a model for development for the world today, isn't it? Even today, the United States largely depends on taking from others. The whole play of the dollar control. Why the US have the world's largest military, which has troops in 200 countries across the world, to maintain that control so that it can maintain its advantage of the cheaper goods. US users, consumers, typically consume 99% of their goods from outside, produced from outside the US. If this domination was removed, there would be a collapse economically. The British Empire was based on the rule and plunder of India. The moment they lost India, the entire global empire collapsed. Why? Because it was based on India. When they had a battle in Africa, they lost a war. There was a war tax placed on India. You understand how the machinery works. The domination and usurpation of wealth was necessary to maintain these gigantic empires. They could not produce independently. I've digressed a little bit to highlight this point when I say that India was self-sustaining and producing in excess, then exporting to all over the world. So you have a crisis in, this is recorded in the Roman Empire, there's a crisis of finance. The treasury is going empty because everybody is buying the goods from India. So they pass a law banning the Roman citizens from buying Indian goods to protect the treasury. Why? They cannot produce it internally, or at least of that standard. So there is enough evidence. I'm not going to this. This is not the primary objective. I'm coming to the idea that here was a plenitude of wealth built on the spiritual foundations of the Veda. Spirituality is not poverty. It is not weakness. It is not denial of life. It is fulfillment of life. It is increase of plenitude. It is increase of wealth and strength and knowledge and love and harmony and all these and beauty. All these are essential to the spirituality of India in its origin. Contrast this with what we see today. Spirituality being associated with ugliness, with poverty, weakness, incapacity, and celebrated. We saw this in Mahatma Gandhi's teaching. He, as you know, was not a Hindu. He was a Christian. Many people don't know this. In South Africa, he wanted to convert to Christianity. He followed the Tolstoyan Christianity. He wanted to convert, and there was a Jain monk who said, don't do that because it will be, for the whole community, it will be a shock. Continue your beliefs, but stay without conversion. So his first ashram he creates, it was called Tolstoy ashram, because that was his line of thought and belief. He comes into India and he finds that there's not much interest in his Tolstoy Christianity. He sees people going to the Gita, so he takes the book and makes commentaries on the Gita. What does it teach? Be weak, be demure, be subjugated, place your head before the British so that they may whack you. I don't know if you know this. This is actually the reality of the whole Gandhian movement. They would take off the cap, place their head before the British. Wait, these were Indian troops under British rule. They would whack your head, you would go back bleeding and put bandages. This was the opposition. Be meek, the meek shall inherit the earth, etc. And this he gave on the basis of the Gita, which teaches the very opposite: fight with strength for the right. So the problem was he hijacked symbols and icons and taught something which was contrary of the deeper civilizational roots. And this is the reason why to this day the media and the political parties, and particularly the West, keeps hammering Gandhi on India and calls Gandhi father of the nation. No, he was not. He was the father of partition. He caused partition by his policies. He selected partition as the option. Sri Aurobindo sent him a special emissary saying that, accept the Cripps mission, this is the last chance to avoid partition. Gandhi rebuffed it. So you can say he's father of Pakistan. And I'm not the one to say this, the Pakistanis say this. If not for him, there would not have been a Pakistan. There is no father of Indian nation. The rishis, at best you can say, are the progenitors of the Indian civilization. And Indian civilization is not the India of today, which is a fragmented cut-off part with the arms cut off. The entire space, which we call the Indian subcontinent, is the spiritual India. If you go to the ashram in Pondicherry, the mother, at the time of partition of India, she drew a map of united India. And she said, this is the spiritual map of India. And until these parts reunite around the mother, it will go through a lot of suffering. And it will happen. And the process, the method is through a gradual coming together to form a federal structure, which you see for the first time in the SAARC association, which begins with a cultural unity and maybe moves gradually to an economic unity and so on. But that is the full scope of the Indian civilizational body. And this is very important because the civilizational is not in abstraction. It has a body, a physical body, a shape and a people. This is the reason why Pakistan as a nation does not have a soul. It has not an identity of itself, because the soul is still with India. You can't cut off an arm and say this arm is a different person. Therefore, it is ruled by its ego sense. And how does the ego exist? How does it create separation? By fear or hatred. To cut off, to maintain separation. How does this arm cut off remain separate from the body? It cannot exist without the body. So it must keep thinking of the body, but to remain separate, fear or hatred. And this is what you see in the Pakistan army, you're taught fear and hatred of India. It is put on religious grounds, etc., but whatever. The moment you remove that fear and hatred, the people meet each other, your friends, your brothers. There is no separation. This is what happens when people go across the border and meet on a one-to-one level. There's no problem. They are so happy. They say, you're from India, we will not charge you here. You have your food free. You know what happened during some cricket matches and other things. This fear-hatred is held at the top in the political brass and imprinted in the army because that's the only way to maintain separation. I'm digressing, but these are all important key concepts without which we will not understand the civilizational body and framework. So I come back to this idea, this plenitude and thriving civilization grows, spreads across the world through influence, economic and cultural and spiritual, sets in motion so many traditions across the world. Even the Christian tradition finds its roots in the Buddhist teachings which go across. I don't know how much you're aware of this. And it is that which forms the foundation of what later becomes Christianity. So, and of course, you go to Japan today, they still look up to India as the mother of our civilizational values because it is from India that all this knowledge, Buddhism and other traditions come. So this is a wide-ranging and yet no domination or colonization. This is an extraordinary model. Why is this possible? How is this possible? If you had such power and wealth, why didn't you just go around and colonize others? Therein lies the difference between the European model and the Indian model. Where in Europe, the method, at least the line of thinking which is used to justify this value system, and I will say the value system determines this line of thinking, is what we call the Darwinian evolution, survival of the fittest. The stronger will dominate and absorb the weaker or destroy it. This thinking comes from the value system of the civilization. And that's why science takes that line. Why didn't Darwin saw the evidence for it? Why didn't he speak of interdependence and cooperative evolution? Even today, we don't teach that in our textbooks in India. It's still Darwinian evolution which dominates and destroys the other. All the evidence in science is for collaborative and cooperative evolution. Evolution is associated with domination. That's the error. And we have not corrected that in our own textbooks. Evolution is cooperative, collaborative. There can be no other evolution finally. If you dominate and destroy the other, you will destroy yourself eventually because of the interdependence. Isn't it? So, with that idea of domination, the moment you become powerful, you start invading and taking over others. That's the European model. It is more subtle now because the invasion is done through the World Bank. You colonize by the control of the currency and you impose whatever rules, etc. You know the game, I don't elaborate on it. But the Indian model starts with this assumption that all of us, equally children of the divine, souls in evolution, are growing in our evolution, which is primarily spiritual, psychological, and therefore incidentally physical and biological also. But its primary drive is of the soul. But all of us are equally in that evolutionary movement. Therefore, domination is not relevant. It's not even that you don't dominate, that you hold back from domination. The concept itself is so artificial and fake and meaningless. And this is the key difference also between dharma and religion. You look at this word religion in the European context, it's a groupthink. Do you belong to this religion? Are you participating in the groupthink? No, then you're the other. You are our enemy. You are that groupthink. And each groupthink is trying to gain more souls in their control. The religion itself is binding together, unifying as a groupthink in a community. And surely it serves a purpose at a certain stage of evolution. But you could give a deeper sense, it is that which relinks back to the divine. But that's not the way they think about it, except in the mystical traditions of the religions. But that is the sense of yoga, isn't it? But unlike that groupthink, in the Indian context, we don't have the word for religion. There is no such word. We have dharma. Implicit to the word dharma, underlying truth of being, let's say, there's a collective dharma, there's an individual dharma. Implicit to the idea is my dharma is unique to me as your dharma is unique to you. Your way of relating to the divine is unique to you. Sri Aurobindo points to these three central ideas of the Indian civilization. First idea that there is one truth, one divine, one origin, which is therefore also one culmination, one goal for all. There are no two. You can look at that one in many different ways. As they say in the tradition, the wise describe it in many different terms, but it is still one. So when the Europeans say that, oh, India is henotheism, they had a problem with India because it didn't fit into their definitions of religion. It was not multiple gods, it was not one, it was something which they couldn't understand. They had to invent a word, henotheism. And the result is they say, oh, these people, they have 1 crore gods. I don't know where that thing comes from, but it's completely made up. There's no such belief in India. But your children are taught this is what the Hindus believe, this is Hinduism. You worship monkeys, you worship donkeys. There's one. It's very clear, there's no doubt about that. But in the Veda that describes the oneness is approached through many different facets, powers, aspects. Each aspect is entirely the whole, but in an aspect. And this is the complex concept of the divine. But more importantly, more interestingly, there are infinity of aspects and powers, qualities of the divine, Adanta Gunam. And each one of us is as if an aspect, a projection, unique, distinct expression of that, but wholly that because that is indivisible. Your soul, therefore, is one with that and not a part of that, not a fragment cut off. It is entirely that in a special aspect put out. Within you is the entire potentiality of the one divine consciousness. And yet, because it is a distinct aspect, uniquely yours, there's no other like you in the whole creation, across space, across time. Therefore, you have a unique relationship with that one. So this comes to the second idea. The first idea was there is only one divine origin. The universe is the one expression of that oneness. The second idea is each one of us, different in form, appearance, and tendencies, has a unique relationship with that. And each, therefore, has a unique way of recovering that. So, as many people, so many approaches. And if we had to use the word religion, we would say so many religions. There may be common features. Oh, we are all common in our bhakti, in our devotion. But my particular turn of bhakti is to this aspect, yours is towards that aspect, or whatever variations, innumerable variations. Swami Vivekananda makes a very interesting observation. He says, in the context of the West of religions, you'll notice there's a tendency constantly for religions to break up into subgroups. Today, even though Christianity starts with one founder, they say there are more than 300 or 1,000 denominations, and each of them is fighting. Each is saying, I alone will go to heaven, all you guys will go to hell. Which one is true? There's a big problem among themselves. They fight among each other. The Pope chastised another group which says, you are stealing our flock. But it's okay if we both combine together to create new flock in India, convert India to. So they gang up together when it suits, or they fight each other when they have exhausted their conquering tendency of gaining more souls. See, it's inherent to the mindset. So the problem, Swami Vivekananda points out, is this tendency of religion to split. If it continues to split until there is one religion for each person, that would be spirituality. Very interesting insight. So here you find the unification of these two concepts, spirituality and religion. Religion forces a groupthink upon you. When you break out of narrow groupthink or use that as a base to deepen to your own personal, true, spontaneously felt soul relationship with the divine, that's spirituality. The Indian civilization being founded in spirituality, this concept is inherent to everything. And I don't mean just governance, I don't mean just economic, everything, sciences, music, arts, philosophy, the works. That although the truth is one, it expresses infinitely diverse ways, and each one of us has a unique way of approaching it. Therefore, even a teacher looks to see what is your innate temperament, innate soul aspiration, which is reflected in your temperament, which is even reflected in your tendencies and interests. And uses that as the leverage, as your starting point for your self-discovery and world discovery. It is the same thing, you go into the martial arts. And this is an interesting thing. Anything you take up, even what in the West would be secular, is here rooted in spirituality, in the relationship with the divine. You go to Kalarigram nearby. You learn Kalariprayatu. What happens there? In the big arena where you train, on the corner is God. But God, not just that. In aspect of powers of expression, weapons which are powers of action as well as defense. And you are, so to say, miniature God, develop in your evolution through the training program these different powers and weapons of action, assault or defense. And the nature of the play, the battle itself, is God meeting God in this complex interchange. Interesting. So the training is inherently spiritual, and the preceptor, the guru, the one who teaches you, is transmitting his realization to you. It's not just skills that you learn by watching a video or experimenting and exploring with yourself. It's not merely skill training. It's a whole value system which is embedded and transmitted, and with it a power and a capacity transferred. Now this comes to the observation just earlier about nothing can be taught, and I'll just touch upon this. If you play on this idea, when you say nothing can be taught, which is the first principle of true teaching, Sri Aurobindo writes, when you observe carefully what happens when you actually learn. You've all had this experience as students. Somebody, teacher is repeating words. I don't understand. Please repeat. So teacher repeats, eventually gets exasperated and say, think harder. Hey, I'm thinking, I don't get it. At that point, somebody else in your classroom tells you, hey, look at it this way. You shift your perspective and suddenly you have a flash of understanding. I got it. Catch that moment. What happened there? What did you do? You shifted your perspective and discovered. There was a covering as if blocking you. The covering was removed. And in that moment, there is an identity with that knowledge, with that insight. It's so obvious. It's so simple. You are excited. You have a luminosity. You have a light in your mind lit up. Consciousness lit up. Knowledge lights up. And these are not mere metaphors. These are real experiences within you of a light in your mind. I know. I am what I know. This discovery, Sri Aurobindo observes, all true learning is a discovery of something already known within you. When you say, it's so simple, it's so obvious, what do you mean? Somewhere inside me, I already knew it and it was covered and that covering was removed and the light shines out. I am already one with that knowledge. This experience, I know, I call it the aha experience, is inherent to all true learning. If you have not had the aha experience, you have not learnt. Very simple. You have learned by heart, you have repeated words without understanding. But you have understood when you have had the aha experience of discovery that somewhere within you, you already knew it, now it's evident to you from where you knew it. So this is a fundamental shift in the whole concept of knowledge and acquisition of knowledge. Where in the European paradigm, the knowledge is acquired from outside. In the Indian paradigm, you're taught all knowledge is inherent within you, and the process of external interaction is one of drawing out what you already knew. Therefore, the teacher cannot teach you. The teacher can only assist you in that movement of drawing out what was already known within you. That's why nothing can be taught, but all can be discovered. And the teacher's relationship with you is that of a friend who assists you to discover from internally from within you. Once you've understood this, you can actually change the entire interaction of classroom to assist the aha experience. And to the extent you're able to draw out the aha experience, what is learnt for good. Because it's not learned by heart, it's not something you can forget because you're one with what you know, because you've become it. So sometimes when I have to teach technical things, I will get students to that point of the aha experience and from there build the formula as a consequence of what you know. Now what happens? You go for the exam, you forget the formula, no problem. I lean back to my aha where I know and recover the formula by the inevitable logic of what I know. I recreate it at that moment. Nothing is ever forgotten because you are one with what you know. So the concept of knowledge and discovery of knowledge is also an inside out and spiritually rooted. Therefore, there is the great Upanishad where this student comes back from all his learning of so many 64 arts and so many sciences and administration and governance, and he comes back to his teacher who is a rishi, and the rishi asks him, oh wonderful, you have learned all these things. Did they teach you that by knowing which all is known? And the student is amazed, is this even possible? And the Upanishad then continues how to discover that by knowing which all is known. Even this concept that there is such a thing by knowing which all is known is inherent to, well, it's spiritual. But the nature of spirituality is not something where you abandon life to go and find something. It is the drawing out of this which is already within you, in which all knowledge, and I gave the example of Kalari, all power, forceful action, love, beauty, harmony, all these flow out from that inherent spiritual root, foundation, self, soul within you. There is no other thing, there is no harmony other than harmony of the self. There is no beauty than the revelation of this ananda of the self. What is beauty? You again go to the science of today. They are trying to understand. You put AI on top of it. What is beauty? Define it. You can't define. The best they've come to is its symmetricity. When there's more symmetricity, it's more beautiful. Not true. That is one form of beauty. You look at a beautiful face in profile, there is no symmetricity, and yet it's beautiful, isn't it? So your definition breaks with just very simple example. And the Indian civilization is the only culture which has defined beauty. You find this in Kalidasa, in Sanskrit, Kshane Kshane Nutanam Upeti Tadeva Rupam Ramaniyataya. From moment to moment, that which expresses newness, that is the form of delight or beauty. You look at a beautiful flower or a baby that's sleeping, oh, so sweet, oh, so beautiful, oh, so beautiful, oh, so beautiful. And you can keep looking. You don't get bored because at each moment it's revealing something new and something new and something new and something new. That's beautiful. In other words, beauty inherently is a spiritual experience. Yes, it can have a reflection in form, it can express through form, but inherently it is a spiritual quality and presence that glows out through form. And when that glow is there, the form is beautiful. When that glow is lost, the same face, I don't see the shine, it's somehow not so beautiful anymore. And again, there can be degrees and different gradations of substance, different bodies through which this can glow out, through the mind, through the vital, through the physical, and so on. There's a whole complex potential there. But it is inherently the light of the Ananda, of the Satchidananda, that is beauty. You see? That's the deeper truth of it. So here's a civilization which in every field, including arts and sciences, goes back to these fundamentals of spirituality. Builds it for millennia. And coming back to my story, I digressed from all that. And in this plenitude, there is a danger of losing the point of it all. And there is, of course, the problem of the human suffering. Despite all this external plenitude and richness that the civilization creates, I have these problems, I'm unhappy, I have conflicts, I have problems. You know, you go to an astrologer when you have a problem, he looks at your face, the first thing he says, big problem. He's playing you, huh? It's a mind reading. Which one is it? Health, wealth, romance? There's no other problems. Think about it. You could reduce all human problems broadly to these three. Any guesses, depending on how miserable you look? That's a romance problem. Oh, you're tense, you're worried. That's not romance, that's a wealth problem. Guesses, okay. But this suffering. And so the Buddha takes up this question. And what is interesting about the Buddha is that he does not say what is the ultimate solution for suffering, which would go right back to the civilizational aspiration. He takes the question of what is the shortest way out of suffering. Shortest way. This is a very important qualifier. Because in the original Vedic tradition is the way shown to discover the Satchidananda. But it's a longer way. It is the fulfillment of evolution, accelerated evolution, but still, you're here for that. But his approach is the shortest way, and the shortest way he discovers, he goes one after another to some of the greatest yogis of his time. He becomes a master of Raja Yoga. Very few people know this because the Buddhists don't talk about it. All the teachings of the Buddha in the practices of Buddhism are drawn from the yoga tradition. The Buddhists don't like it because then the identity and separateness of Buddhism is somehow compromised. I'm sorry, I'm saying things which will hurt a few people, but please face the reality and get provoked. Think about it. So he goes to all these teachers. This part they will tell you. He went to all these teachers, he didn't find his solution. What did he do? He learned with them. He went through the practices. Then he withdraws and says, I have to find my own solution. And through the processes which he has learned of Raja Yoga, he finds his most direct solution, which is what? Get out of the multiplicity of creation. Get out of the appearance of divisions. Get back to a deep essential oneness. And there you are free from suffering. It's the shortest route. It's bypassing evolution, getting out of evolution. But when he approaches that oneness, that underlying, again, Buddhists don't like the word oneness because they will speak of interdependent oneness in the multiplicity. They don't have an essential oneness because God and soul have been thrown out in Buddhism. You must understand these are very important points because otherwise you won't understand the problem. So when he comes to that underlying, let's say, essence, or even they don't like that word, he discovers it's an emptiness, or the words he uses are emptiness. And the dissolution of your separateness is what dissolves you, frees you from suffering. That is the Dissolution and emptiness is the nirvana, the blowing out of the flame of separateness. Now you must understand, when you look at it this way, you have stepped out of evolution, and if this was the goal, you would have never entered evolution. So he finds his shortest route as a consequence of the tremendous power of his realization. Many around him also experience this nirvana, and the foundation of the whole formality of the Buddhism emerges from there. Sri Aurobindo points out that there's a distinction, and we'll come to that shortly. Let me complete the next step of the story. Soon after, you have Shankaracharya. As is well known, he is traditionally recognized to be an emanation of Shiva. What does he do? He brings back God and soul, which were thrown out from Buddhism. See, when Buddha was asked, is there God? He keeps quiet. He does not reply. This is documented. He does not reply. Why? It's a very important question. Because if he says yes, then the next question would be, then why don't we get to God? He can't say no, because he has experienced the reality of that thing which we call divine God, whatever. He can't say no. But he won't say yes, because that's not his teaching. That's not the line of his solution. So he keeps quiet. It's a diplomatic, strategic silence. But the end result was, in Buddhism, soul and God have been thrown out. What is left then is mechanical nature. And this mechanical nature, interdependence, that's the unity they talk about. So when you say unity, they say unity, it's very different. In this interdependence of the whole mass of mechanical nature, what's left? The only law is this interdependent compulsions of karma. So suddenly in Buddhism, karma becomes this overwhelming power. And you're bound in the wheel and machinery of life. You are stuck, you need to get free. And there is no other way except to get out of it, by self-extinction, into the dissolution in emptiness. Which is not empty, it's full. That's part of the problem of the vocabulary. Fine, we accept that. But world is reduced to this gigantic machinery. Karma becomes overwhelming. In the Veda, you will rarely find karma in this way used. When Shankaracharya now comes to bring back soul, bring back God, because there's a huge loss for the civilization, which rooted itself in these ideas. It's a huge loss. He brings back self and soul and God, but now he has to accept this problem, suffering. He comes to the same, in India, it's not about argument. Philosophy is not talking with ideas. It's about finding experience and articulating experience. So we call it darshana, vision, living experience. And from that you speak. So the experience he has of that one and the liberation from suffering is one of blissfulness. So he says, Chidananda Rupa Shivoham. I am one with the Lord in his bliss. But in relation to that, he says, the world appears to be an illusion. Your suffering is part of the illusion. Get out of the illusion. Now, this is a very important transition, because through now his power and the affirmation of his experience, he drives out Buddhism from India, which then spreads all around, but does not stay in India. Because civilizational values did not align with the Buddhist conclusions. This is very important to state. It's not comfortable to state in a politically correct atmosphere, but we have to face it. That's why Buddhism had to be, in that sense, driven out, so that the civilizational march could continue in the line set by the Veda. The Veda comes back with it. But in the process, the world has been abandoned as unreal. So come a series of Ramanujacharya, Madhvacharya, who bring back the assertion that this too is divine. Sarvam khalu idam brahma. All this verily is divine. But the power of the Buddhist experience and the Shankarite experience are so strong, because they turn to the negation, the negative aspect of self, that these other traditions do not have the same hold. And as a consequence, in time, the illusoriness of the world becomes more and more prevalent. With that, the best minds of society turn away from life, because that's the greater thing to do. That's the greater thing to realize. With that begins the decline of the civilization. Its strength drops, because all your powers and energies which were turned to realization now are withdrawn to an inner realization. And the civilization weakens. Invasions begin. You must understand that invasions did not start with Islamic invasions. All attempts were there even before, when the Alexander decides he wants to conquer the world, what's the first step to world conquest? Conquer the most powerful and wealthy country in the whole world. Then you can conquer the rest easily. What does he turn to? India. Who are his primary fighters? Indian mercenaries. So he travels from Greece all across the Middle East, approaching India to conquer India, because you start world conquest with the most powerful and wealthy. As he approaches India with the Indian mercenaries, on the edge of India, the mercenaries say, we will not fight our own people. So generous Alexander says, please go back to your country. One condition, leave behind all your weapons. So you remember, these mercenaries were traveling with families. They often had wives and children. The entire Indian mercenary group moves out. He turns to his Greek warriors and says, we will never defeat these people. We must butcher every single one of them. The Greeks come and kill every single mercenary who has served Alexander in his conquests. With their wives and children, nobody survives. It's only the Greeks who call him Alexander the Great. I do not know why our textbooks still say that. This is the most perverse that any leader could be, and shows you what would have happened had he conquered the world. Coarse, crude, pitiless. And then when he has the fight with Purushottama, again and again, he cannot defeat him. And the Greek story is, oh yes, some elephant fell and finally he conquered and gave back his kingdom. Would such a man ever give back a kingdom if he had conquered it? The reality is, Greek sources themselves, of course Alexander, his own source says he conquered and now gave back the kingdom and came back. Doesn't fit. Greek sources say he was defeated so many times that his own generals rebelled and he gives in and returns. This is Greek sources. It's like Cleopatra, when she lost the war with the Romans, he comes back and says, celebrate, we won the war and I made peace with them. Very convenient. The same story applies here. Purushottama then handsomely rewards him. He says, you were a great warrior, I give you gifts. And among the gifts, there's gold, 16 kilograms of Indian steel, which was more valuable than gold. And with that, he goes back. So you must understand, attacks took place all the time. But the strength of the civilization, ability to defend because it lived life fully, spiritually. That weakens when the most powerful people turn away from life, describing life as illusory, unreal, meaningless, pointless. And with that, the fall of the weakness begins the invasions, and with that, the destruction of the civilization and the loss of knowledge. Because when you don't live a truth, you only cling to imitations and ritualistic external forms. The entire civilization now collapses. Sri Aurobindo points out that if not for the Islamic invasions, India would have become a nation of monks. You look back at the literature of 500 years ago, the Bhakti literature, where people withdrew from life in the suffering that came with the invasions. They withdrew from the pain of life by the devotionalism. Across India, you have this awakening of the Bhakti. And with that, this fatalism, God's will, whatever is God's will, and it will happen, you have to do nothing, etc. All these ideas come during that phase. And the weakness and impotence in action. And all you do is reduce it to ritual. I follow my ritual, the rest doesn't matter somehow. We have a story in Maharashtra of the Peshwa. When the invasions come, Islamic invasions, he says, what is there? Let them take over. They have just entered the border. What is there? Let them take over. It's all illusory. They have come and hit the treasury. What is there? Gems and gold. That is just it's like dust. That's the story. And finally, the fellow comes and is about to kill him. He says, please spare my life. This is the story of, which was the temple in Gujarat, Somnath temple, which was destroyed 18 times, looted, plundered, and all the wealth. You rebuilt it, and again they came looted and plundered. You rebuilt it 18 times. And that shows you the degree of decline in the civilizational value, the weakness and impotence which was celebrated. So there's a story, it's a novelist story by one of the writers, I don't remember the name. He describes how the king, who has gone now to defend the temple, and the temple is again sacked, he comes back home and the queen is packing her bags and leaving. He says, "Why are you leaving?" She said, "You did not fulfill your duty as king." He says, "I did." "What did you do?" "I sat with the priests and prayed to God. I prayed to Shiva to come and save his temple." The queen looks at him and says, "I thought you were Shiva." You see the power of that. "I thought you were Shiva. It was your duty to save." This weakening, emaciation of the civilization is the consequence of that dismissing the world as illusory. And so we have the invasions, the colonization, etc. And through all that, the shock of that forces the civilization to wake up through pain. And the last phase of the colonization, when the British are about to be thrown out, you have the Gandhian colonization of the mindset, where he says, the more you suffer, the more pure you will become. Through weakness and poverty, you will gain your freedom. He delayed freedom. 1922, the British came to the negotiating table and Gandhi said to them, "We are not interested in freedom. We first demand that you should give the right to our Muslim brothers to have the Caliph of Turkey as their spiritual, religious and political head." How ridiculous can this be? That a people in India should have as their political head the Caliph of Turkey. And it throws away the entire freedom movement to protect this imagined right, which divided India into two entities, religious entities, in the political movement itself. I am tempted to read, if you permit me, a text of Sri Aurobindo where he comments on this, and it's quite a powerful text regarding Gandhi. There are two texts. We'll read the second one. So this is regarding some writing by somebody, Kripalani, who actually blames partition on the original freedom fighters, including Sri Aurobindo. So Sri Aurobindo's response to that, written to Nirod Baran. Subject, politics, taboo. Writer Kripalani, a romantic and idealistic visionary without hold on realities, living only in academic ideas, so not worth commenting. But then Sri Aurobindo describes of what he did in the freedom movement. All the present Congress lot seem to be men who live in ideas only, mostly second-hand. Borrowed from Europe, socialism, communism, etc. Nothing has changed even today. Mostly. Borrowed from Gandhi, borrowed from tradition or borrowed from anywhere. Kripalani looks down on the old moderates for being in a different way exactly what he himself is. Only they were classics and not romantics. So what is the use of reading their histories? However, now Sri Aurobindo writes, quite privately and within brackets, I will enlighten you on one or 2 points. First, the Swadeshi movement, this is what Sri Aurobindo began. The Swadeshi movement was idealist on one side. No great movement can go without an ideal. But it was perfectly practical in its aims and methods. We were quite aware of the poverty of India and its fallen condition, but we did not try to cure the poverty by Khaddar and Hindi prachar. So Gandhi had this obsession that every house, everybody should sit and spin their own clothing. And you had to speak Hindi. So that was his way for freeing India. It's not quite logical, but so he criticizes that. We advocated the creation of an industrial India and made the movement a Swadeshi. Swadeshi means of your own independent country. In order to give the new births a field and favorable conditions. Cottage industries were not omitted in our view, but there were no fads. Gandhi was a faddist, typically. He would catch something and exaggerate. The Swadeshi movement created the following very practical effects. A, it destroyed the moderate reformist politics and spread the revolutionary mentality, as Jawaharlal now calls it, and the ideal of independence. B, it laid the foundations of an industrial India, not of course wholly industrial, that was not our intention, which is however slowly growing today. C, it brought in the commercial classes and the whole educated middle class into the political field. So that was the foundation Sri Aurobindo laid. And not the middle class only, while moderatism had touched only a small fringe. D. It had not time to bring the peasantry, but it had begun the work, and Gandhi only carried it further on his flashy and unsound but exciting methods. E. It laid down a method of agitation which Gandhi took up and continued with 3 or 4 startling additions. So the basic framework was already laid. He kind of just hijacked it and then subverted it. So what are the startling additions? Khadar, that's spinning. Hindiism, satyagraha equals getting beaten with joy. You know what I described earlier. You went and got whacked, came back and suffered. The more you suffer, the more pure you grow. You know, that's okay. Getting beaten with joy. Khilafat, that's what's created the split. The Muslims having their own caliph in Turkey, which British said very happy. They said, yes, please let them have their Turkey caliph. And then they killed the caliph. So what happened to the Muslims who suddenly had been promised their caliph? They turned against Hindus, and these were the first major riots. They butchered Hindus in anger against British. Doesn't make sense, but that's the reality, thanks to Gandhi. Harijan, you know what Harijan is? Okay. What today are called Dalits, people who are extremely poor. And this you must understand, how did they become poor? They are all working classes. They were all skilled craftsmen. Under British rule from 1850 to 1900, there were a series of famines which destroyed the entire livelihood and the industrial base. These famines were deliberately created by British policies in order to weaken India. And there's a letter of the Viceroy of India at that time where he writes, 10% of the population dies of starvation. That means in a family of 10, one has died. What happens to the other 9? You think they're eating heartily? They're all on the brink of starvation. That's the scope of the starvation in India by those policies. And the British Viceroy writes to Parliament or King. He says, I have never seen so much misery in my life. The bones of the weavers and workers are filling the plains. I'm paraphrasing. But he says, my interest is to protect my country's people and their wealth. So he continues those policies. Again, if you see end of the Second World War, when India is about to be free, 1945-46, you have massive famines on the east coast of Orissa and Bengal because the grain the farmers had grown was taken away by the British for their troops, leaving behind nothing, creating an artificial famine. This was a part of British policy to create famine after famine, to weaken people, to bring them to the brink of survival where they will beg for any little drop that you give and they will accept all your rules. And that's how they created indentured labor, took people across the world. And so we have the Indian diaspora is the world's largest diaspora because they were all taken as bonded laborers to protect their families' survival. And they accepted the best men would go and serve to go into the British colonies to become indentured labor elsewhere. So it's just a background. So this is the Khilafat, Harijan, etc. So the Harijan, so-called, were the British creation, which now Gandhi takes up and which today is used by for conversions, etc. All these had an advertisement value, a power of picking up things which was certainly livelier than anything we put into it. Sri Aurobindo writes. Whether the effects of these things have been good is a more doubtful question. And really today with hindsight we can see how much damage it created in society. To this day, Indian society is divided into all these categories and the politicians have only worsened it. When India got her political freedom, the constitution said, all right, for these depressed classes, we put reservation for 10 years only. 70 years later, the reservations have grown to more than 50%. More and more people based on religion are being added into reservations, basically driving out everybody else and reducing the standards and making people lazy and dependent. That's the politicians' objectives, always, because they need to keep you dependent. So, you see these consequences, they all go back to Gandhi's actions. This was part one of the benefits. Second result of the Sri Aurobindo's working. As a matter of fact, the final effects of Gandhi's movements have been a tremendous fissure between the Hindus and Mohammedans, which is going to be kept permanent by communal representation. You see the foresight, and that becomes the basis of partition. B, a widening fissure between caste Hindus and Harijans. You see the division today, all the society split. And Karnataka government, for example, is saying 5%, 2%, 3%. You play with percentages for political expediency of reservations, adding more. Nobody can be removed once added into reservation. So this is Sri Aurobindo telling you this 100 years ago. A widening fissure between caste Hindus and Harijans to be made permanent in the same way by representation. C, a great confusion in Indian politics which leaves it a huge mass of division, warring tendencies, no clear guide of compass anywhere. D, a new constitution which puts the conservative class in power to serve as a means of maintaining British domination. That's your Gandhian clique, Nehruvian clique. Maintaining British domination, or at least an intolerable brake on progress. Also divides India into 5 or 6 Indias: Hindu, Muslim, Pariya, Christian, Sikh, etc. See what's happening today? We even have different laws for different religious communities. Unacceptable in any formation of a country which wants integrity of its people. E, a big fiasco of the non-cooperation movement, which is throwing politics back on one side to reformism, on the other to blatant and insincere socialism. Again, you see Nehruvian attempt to turn India into a socialist, even communist state. So that, I think, Sri Aurobindo writes, is the sum and substance of the matter. Then comes a very interesting observation, very relevant today, because we are heading for another partition. If you look at the demands being placed on society by religious groups, want to separate out India into a piece. As for the Hindu-Muslim affair, I saw no reason why the greatness of India's past or her spirituality should be thrown into the waste paper basket in order to conciliate the Muslims, who would not at all be conciliated by such a stupidity. This was the Gandhian problem. He was eager to conciliate by throwing away what is most valuable in order to appease, which only serves, there's a term in Islamic rule, they call dhimmi. Dhimmi is a group that is owned by mind. They're subservient. So to put a people into a position of subservience is dhimmitude. And that's a strategy. What has created the Hindu-Muslim split was not Swadeshi, that was Sri Aurobindo's movement, but the acceptance of the communal principle by the Congress. There Tilak made his great blunder, because he accepted that principle at some point as a conciliatory effort. And the further attempt by the Khilafat movement to conciliate them and bring them in is on wrong lines. This is in the 1930s, Sri Aurobindo is saying. The recognition of that communal principle at Lucknow made them permanently a separate political entity in India, which ought never to have happened. The Khilafat affair made that separate political entity an organized separate political power. See the distinction between the two things. It was not Swadeshi boycott, national education, Swaraj, our platform, which made this tremendous division. How could it? So I skip the rest. There you are, I'm skipping a portion. There you are on a tabooed subject. It is, I think, enough, not at all for circulation, you understand, and quite confidential. 1936 April. But you see how practical Sri Aurobindo was. This is how spirituality must be practical. Because it has to see everything from a deeper underlying principle and oneness, and find a means to bring that oneness into its overt organization of harmony and beauty and strength and wisdom in love. That would be spirituality. That was India's ancient spirituality. What happened subsequently through what I described and the invasions was a further crushing of some of these values, but at least survival of something in order to survive, not to die out, not be killed. And the last stage of Gandhiism, which warped it totally by making weakness and poverty spiritual. And this comes from the Tolstoyan Christianity straight away. The meek shall inherit the earth and so on. That kind of thinking. It did not represent the Indian ethos, culture, civilizational values. And that's why to this day they will hammer Gandhi on you, because they want you to stay in that dhimmi mindset, in that dependent, in that subservient, weak, poor. It was barely, I think, 15, 20 years ago, one of the Congress party leaders, very senior national leader, in a meeting in Chennai, where a prince from one of the kingdoms of Europe, they still have some kings and princes, like in India, we still have some, they don't play an active role. One of them was visiting on a mission. He is on this platform with this king, prince, and he says, publicly he says, I don't name the person. He says, after this public meeting, I am going to come to you with my begging bowl to ask for alms. This is, I think, in around 2005, 2006. This is so sad. I was so disappointed to see this. And that's when around 2006, the Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh, stated in Parliament that Muslims have the first right to all national resources of India. These are all statements of partition, cutting society along religious lines, giving preference to one religion, which inherently wants to convert and destroy the civilizational values of India. And here's the other person, again from the same leadership, declaring his status as one who is a beggar to the European. He is a trivial king, he doesn't even have any real wealth today. And this mentality in the ruling class, because remember, like Nehru, they are still rulers of India. So I'm completing that circle of the decline to point now to the awakening. But I'm going to go back again to a few more statements which I covered, reviewing what happened. You see, the decline begins with this turn away from life. You see this happening with Buddha, followed by Shankaracharya. Both effectively gave a solution which involved withdrawal from life. One because life is suffering, the other because life is illusion. But still the withdrawal then became so compelling, and it was compelling because of the nature of the spiritual experience. Sri Aurobindo explains the difference. Why is it that when Buddha found his solution and Shankara found his solution, they were so different? He explains the Buddha also in his solution was looking for the underlying reality, which is free of the suffering. We'll call it self in the Indian tradition, Atman. But the mechanism through which he approaches this is through the mind and its processes. That's the Raja Yogic process. Through a Jnana Yoga, knowledge means. When mind approaches the self, how does it perceive self? Remember, mind can only know something by contrasting with something else, isn't it? So you have this, and you see the borderline, you divide this into so many parts, divide into pieces, and then rejoin. Analysis, synthesis. So mind, intellect can only know by cutting into finite pieces and rejoining them to rebuild the whole. So you take the human being, here's a human, I ask for a volunteer. Now I'm going to cut you up into parts, all the way down to the cells, all the way down to your DNA, and then assemble you back. What happens? You're dead. Soul is gone. Mind cannot recognize soul because it is inherently one and indivisible. So when mind approaches to know something, it divides, rejoins, divide, rejoins. But when it approaches self, it cannot divide. It cannot rejoin. What does it do? It sees it as a blank, emptiness. But it's not an emptiness which is a non-existence. It is a fullness. So you read any Buddhist literature, listen to someone who has had an experience of nirvana, however partial. They will say it is an emptiness which is full. Okay, so the problem of vocabulary, which we all understand, it's inherent in the Indian tradition that the deepest divine experience cannot be articulated in words. Words always reduce. It's there in the Vedic tradition itself. So when he approaches through mind, he experiences emptiness. Shankara's approach, again to self, is not through mind, it is through the intuitive consciousness. The intuitive consciousness knows things not by dividing and rejoining, but by identity. I'll give you a simple example of that. If I tell you, how do you know that you exist? Maybe you're plugged into the matrix. You remember the movie? You're plugged into the supercomputer. It's creating images in your brain. You're hearing voices, all this is actually an illusion. You're lying in some bed plugged into this machine. How do you know it's not that? You cannot know. If it was a perfect representation, you wouldn't know. How do you know even that you exist then? Here's an interesting answer. You can know that you exist. How? Your physics taught you, your biology taught you, you're just waves of electricity in your brain. And I ask you, well, what is your experience? No, but I know that I exist. Why? You're one with your sense of identity. You're one with your sense of existence. That's the intuitive knowing. When you're one with what you know, that's intuition. Now, there are deeper ranges of the intuition, but this is your first touch of it. When I said the aha experience in education, I know that's the moment of intuitive touch, a flash, a light. That's the intuition. It's a momentary spark, but still it's an intuitive knowing. That stays because you're one with what you know. So when Shankara enters through the intuitive mind, approaching self, he experiences self in oneness with self, not by a mind analysis synthesis. And so the experience is one of blissful Satchidananda. But the problem of intuition is still a consciousness of finite awareness, finite knowledge. It does not know the whole. It has a glimpse of part and aspect. So when he has this experience of the Ananda, it's a part against which the world appears to be unreal, meaningless, illusory, far away, distant, fake. And this is a powerful experience spiritually. But it is so overwhelming, it's easy to stop and say, this is it. But you've still, in the intuitive consciousness, got an aspect of the divine, an aspect of the self. In the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna explains the self is equally static as well as dynamic. The world itself is an expression of the dynamic power of the self to become everything entirely without ever dividing itself, without ever being bound by what it expresses and creates and becomes. It always transcends all that it exists and expresses as. So you have not known self in its entirety. For that, a further step is required. You have to go into a consciousness which is higher still than intuition, which knows infinity. And in that oneness, discover the oneness with the divine and know the self. As the self knows itself by its power of cognition. That Sri Aurobindo calls supermind, which is an English translation of what in the Veda is called Satyam Ritam Brhat Mahas. The truth in dynamic expression, which is vast. That is the nature of the self in its dynamic expression as world in world while still transcending it. And for that you have to go to that higher grade of consciousness, which is its own power of self-cognition. As you approach up the steps of the ladder, you have glimpses, each of which is true in itself but a partial glimpse until you get to the full. This is the inevitable step in our future evolution. And it is to this that Sri Aurobindo points as the future for humanity. And if India has to fulfill her role in the world by rediscovering the deeper spirituality, it will be in this direction. Doesn't mean you have to realize it. At least you recognize this is where we are going and start living by these deeper, higher, truer values. Recast your entire life and governance systems and economic systems, social relations, education and the works around this rediscovery of your deeper truth. Organize your relationships around that and your relationships with others and other countries and civilization and values. That would be India's gift, which would set the pace and initiate a spiritual age of humanity, for which India has to first discover herself, her soul, for which we have to now make that process, start that process of self-discovery and our spiritual roots. And so this big picture of the civilizational rise, peak, as well as the causes of decline and the trigger for the reawakening, this is the big picture I want to share with you. Once you understand this, all else becomes now reasonably clear, simple. And even if you don't read much, you have a sense of a compass through which you will find your way. Fortunately, Sri Aurobindo has elaborately discussed all of these things and even set a framework for the practice of this accelerated evolution. And so I'm going to highly recommend for all of you, first read the Foundations of Indian Culture. You will get a glimpse of the nature of the civilization and its values and the relevance of that to the world. Because a simple question we could have asked, and I'll pause with this. There are so many discussions earlier about civilization losing its roots. Does it matter? So many cultures have died out. The Egyptian civilization is gone. They don't even know how to read their own language and their hieroglyphs. The Greek civilization and its peak of 2000 years ago is gone. Today, Greek is just an ordinary Romanized European country. Nothing of those values remain. What does it matter if this is erased? Why not just become another clone of Europe? Because what is held here is so valuable for Europe and for humanity, for everybody. It is valuable for the future survival of humanity itself. Therefore, this cannot be extinguished. Many other things could be lost. But within this civilizational framework, there are many elements which have ossified, become superficial, pretentious, even false and perverted. Those have to break down. So we're in a transition within India where there's a great, massive division taking place. So many things which we have attached ourselves to are breaking down and need to break down because they have no more relevance for the future. But other things which we have even forgotten need to be rediscovered and brought forward and lived. And that means it's not something you'll follow that you read in a textbook. It's what you will dig deeper into yourself and recover from within you and begin to live your deepest truth. That's your Swadharma, not what a textbook says. The textbook might still help you to find that, but you don't need it. And this is the nature of the Indian civilization. It's not by books. It's by self-experience that you will find the divine. And certainly it will be of a great help if somebody or someone or a community or a book will help you, put you in touch with that, but still you'll have to go through that process. That's your way forward. Therefore, as a spiritual civilization, a great spiritual awakening is required before India can rediscover her soul, and then for humanity then to shift into a greater spiritual age. And this is connected. That's why we're here in this discussion. So I'm going to pause here. I've been told the organizers want to have a break for 10 minutes and then we will continue. If you have any questions, you can think about it, prepare them, and we'll have a more interactive session, second part. Let's take a moment now to center ourselves, think about all that we have discussed and maybe what is evoked more importantly within us in terms of our deeper aspiration and deeper knowledge. And I would suggest that everything I've said to you should resonate with you deeply and evoke in you the aha experience. That you should say, somewhere inside me, I already knew everything. And if you found that, then what you have truly received, understood. If you feel something is still not gelling, it's not yet resonating and emerging as yours, your perspective, your discovery, watch that. There's some correction perhaps needed. Maybe that what I said was wrong, or there's something within you that resists and opposes and you need to harmonize. Observe. But find in yourself the truth of all that we discussed, and it will be your discovery. Namaste.